Hello, it's Miss Heather, piano and voice teacher at Conservatory of the Ozarks. Just working on another study guide. This is for Hymnody. I think I have all my answers in place now. So, Orthodoxy and Pietism. The age of Pietism was from 1675 to 1750. It was a reaction against dry scholasticism, cold formalism, and dead orthodoxy. Philip Spener, from 1635 to 1735, gave this movement, I don't think those are his birth and death dates, surely he didn't live 100 years, gave this movement its direction in Pia Desideria. Ironically, he was the pastor of the same church, St. Nicholas, in Berlin, as Paul Gerhardt. Emphasized a reviving of vital, living, and practical Christianity. Johannes Frelinghuysen, 1670 to 1793, Geistliches Gesangbuch, 1600 hymns, 600 tunes. Count Ludwig von Zinzendorf, 1700 to 1760, was the founder of the Moravian Brethren. He composed over 2,000 hymns. Jesus, Thy Blood and Righteousness, and Jesus, Lead Thou On. Joachim Neander, 1650 to 1680, wrote Praise to the Lord. Benjamin Schmolk, 1672 to 1737, Dearest Jesus, we are here. There was a deterioration of tunes, and the organ had a role. Johann Sebastian Bach, 1685 to 1750, had a role to play. Johannes Frelinghuysen was barely 6 years old at Paul Gerhardt's death in 1676. Frelinghuysen's hymnody, however, marked the end of the era which Gerhardt seems to dominate. It was an era shaped by the tension between two parties in Lutheranism, Pietism and Orthodoxy. These two movements are often associated with different styles of worship and hymnody. Orthodoxy, centering on word and sacrament in music, Pietism on private house devotions and inner piety. Frelinghuysen's life was buffeted by the hostilities between the Orthodox and Pietists. He was introduced to Pietist writings through his college roommate. He transferred to a different university to study under Pietist leaders. His parents were upset by his conversion to Pietism. His name was included in a list nailed up on the local gallows, naming him as a Pietist student who is to be excluded from local pulpits. During his career, Frelinghuysen had sermons and theological articles published, along with 2 theological textbooks, all of which reflect the spirit of Pietism. Frelinghuysen's legacy was his 44 hymns and the hymnal publication Geistliches Gesangbuch, Spiritually Rich Hymns, a combination of 2 separately published collections which included over 1,500 hymns. The combined edition known as Frelinghuysen's Hymnal was published posthumously in 1741 and used for over a century. The new type of hymn which Pietists preferred was different in spirit from the old hymns of the Lutheran tradition. Frelinghuysen's hymnal was accused of being pompous, superficial, and almost licentious in the manner of the secular songs. He was accused of allowing many hopping, jumping, dactylic songs in his new book. There was a tension between the elaborate polyphonic choral settings and simpler music capable of being sung by the congregation. In the 1600s, Gerhardt brought a more heartfelt tone to hymnody. In following years, hymns embraced more emotional depth. These hymns were often written to be sung in the home with keyboard accompaniment. This led to elaborate vocal ornamentation and elaborate realization of the figured bass. This led to a tension between soloistic styles of private hymn singing in ornamented style and the style suited for congregational worship. Frelinghuysen's influential hymnal eroded the distinction between private devotion and congregational song. The Oxford Movement. Okay, the Oxford Movement, known as the Tractarian movement within the Church of England. There was a return to the previous, tracts for our time. The break from Rome threw out too much. Worship services and buildings were too stark in their architecture. There was a rude screen. They were concerned with the whole picture of worship, music, majesty, and mystique. They looked back to the medieval music in the church. There was a breviary. Great translators of hymns from the past. These were not the only two, but were major players. They were translators and poets and theologians. John Mason Neale, 1818 to 1866, died at 41 years old. He translated Latin hymns into vernacular, found hymns in the breviary to translate. Catherine Winkworth, 1827 to 1893, wrote the Lyrica Germanica at 28 years old. It was a German to English translation of Reformation hymns. Paul Gerhardt's influence on English hymnody continued into the 19th century, when many of his hymns were translated, especially by John Kelly and Catherine Winkworth. 90 of his hymns have been translated into English by 50 different people. Music is a sign of continuity within the whole church. It is important that we neither denigrate nor worship our musical heritage. We must have balance. We are in the continuum of a grand tradition. As a church music director, I should be restless and ruthless. I should sift through the old and the new and take only the best into the presence of the King. That's what Luther did. He didn't bring everything back from the past, only the best. As the vanguard for the next generation, Luther had to ask himself how much equilibrium could he give to a process which in our day and age is usually knee-jerk and very political. I must ask how much balance I can provide my congregation between the old and the new. Why do I choose the pieces I choose? Why do I leave out certain hymns? The 1830s Oxford movement culminated in 1861 with Hymns, Ancient and Modern, which has sold 200 million copies. They set a good example for contemporary Christians in how they reached all the way back to the monastic breviary and translated Latin and Greek hymns into the vernacular for use by believers in their own time. I have to ask myself what I am doing in 2017 to help my congregation experience the nurturing, doxological role of music. I should be using hymns to help people lift their eyes to heaven. Discuss the contributions of Isaac Watts and Charles Wesley, along with their similarities and differences. Both Wesleys were Anglican priests. They published 64 hymn collections over 32 years. Wesley's wrote 8,000 hymns, a hymn a day for 21 years. Watts and Wesley were way less metrical than Calvin. Aldersgate Sunday, May 24th, 1738, John Wesley experienced a confirmation of his salvation by the grace of God in a meeting room at Aldersgate Street in London. The Wesleys wrote, Jesus, lover of my soul, love divine, all loves excelling, awake my soul, and with the sun, Jerusalem, my happy home. Gerhardt's hymns have exerted much influence over English hymnody. The singing of German hymns made such an impression on John Wesley, 1703 to 1791, the founder of Methodism, that he translated 37 of them into English, including 3 of Gerhardt's. Watts wrote, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross. Watts was a wordsmith. He knew the poetry of his day. He infused the New Testament into his hymnody through the back door of psalmody. He was 4 years older than Bach. Watts preferred awe over Abba. He didn't like familiarity. Watts wanted reverence. Ora lyrica isn't hymnody. It is religious poetry. Anything would go in ora lyrica. It was adventurous. When it came to the English hymn, Watts wanted to improve literary character, find contemporary application, and apply New Testament theology. Watts used interchangeable text and tune, because he used very few, only 4, meters. Watts wrote a hymn for what he was preaching on. This is practical rather than liturgical. He made an adaptation of opening line to make a quick appeal, customary meters. The hymn is a Christian's response to the gospel, which is a distinct departure from psalmody. John Wesley was an editor, a business manager, took out fondling expressions from hymn texts such as dear, learned German because he was so impressed with chorales, was 4 years younger and lived 3 years longer than Charles. The difference between Watts and the Wesleys: Watts used 4 meters only. The Wesleys used 30 metrical forms, lots of double meter, and had compact, wordy texts. The Deutsche Messe in 1526. The lay people began participating less and spectating more as music became more difficult with polyphonic choral settings. The people did not understand the Latin text of the songs. There were no hymns sung in the Latin Mass. Hymns were only sung during the daily offices, vespers, matins, etc. During Watts, etc., hymn singing in the Church of England was only done in the home, not in the service. Luther wanted to get the people off the pew and participating, so he used the Deutsche Messe in 1526 to turn the people into participators instead of spectators. He wrote a hymn in the vernacular for each of the parts of the Mass so that the congregation could sing the Mass. Troped Kyries were not controversial, so Luther used them as a way to introduce theological hymn singing to the congregation without shocking them. Since the Kyrie is repeated 3 times, Luther troped text about each person of the Godhead, which allowed the congregation to weekly rehearse the attributes of the Trinity in an uncontroversial way. People were already used to a trope Kyrie. Spectators were gone. Now the congregation had a part to sing. Luther set all of the tropes in German. This allowed the congregation to learn about God without feeling terror of him. They learned to love him because he loved them first. The German Mass had no Gloria. Came out late, November 15, 25. Close to the beginning of Advent. Johann Walter, 1496 to 1570, was a close friend and collaborator with Luther on many hymns. For 3 weeks in 1524, Walter lived in Luther's home as they worked on the German Mass and prepared 5-part harmony for Geistliche Gesangbuchlein. Gesang Wuchlang. Music as liturgical song. The lay people began participating less and spectating more as music became more difficult with polyphonic choral settings. The people did not understand the Latin text of the songs. There were no hymns sung in the Latin Mass. Hymns were only sung during the daily offices, Vespers, Matins, etc. During Watts, etc., hymn singing in the Church of England was only done in the home, not in the service. Lay participation, professional participation. Luther wanted to get the people off the pew and participating. The only thing they had to watch for was the hocus pocus, which was the transubstantiation. Hocus pocus, the transubstantiation, when the elements were presented. The bell would be rung, and the elements would be consecrated. What parts of the Mass were sung? In the ordinary, there is the Kyrie, the Gloria, the Credo, the Sanctus, and the Alleluia. Deutsche Messe in 1526. Luther didn't want spectators. He wanted people to participate. He wrote a hymn for each part of the Mass so that the congregation could sing the Mass. Troped Kyrie. Sometimes there were extra words inserted between Kyrie and eleison. Since the Kyrie is repeated 3 times, Luther troped text about each person of the Godhead, which allowed the congregation to weekly rehearse the attributes of the Trinity in an uncontroversial way. People were already used to a troped Kyrie. Spectators were gone. Now the congregation had a part to sing. Luther said all of the trope in German. They were learning about a God they no longer had to fear. They learned to love him because he loved them first. List and discuss Luther's hymns. From where did he draw his materials? For what purpose did he write his hymns? Where and how were they used in public worship? Explain Luther's rationale for use of the music in following ways. A. Proclamation and praise. Viva vox evangelii, living voice of the gospel. Hymns became the living voice of the gospel. Mouth to ears to heart to faith. Nourish. Luther was at the bottom of the learning curve for educating his people. His congregation didn't know much, so Luther had a lot of work to do in educating them. First and foremost, Luther was a pastor. Above all, Luther was a pastor. Luther wed the music with the Word of God to create didactic hymns so he could teach the people the doctrine and theology. During Luther's life, the printing press was allowing the Bible, hymns, and other important books to be translated into the language of the people. The printed hymnals containing the hymns Luther and others wrote meant that the people were singing their theology. People were able to sing the gospel in their own language, and people could learn doctrine more quickly because they could sing. A misconception of Luther's music is that his hymns were only used in church, but not in the homes, around the table, beside the bed, etc. This has been proven untrue. Luther's hymns were sung throughout the week to reinforce his teaching, heard from the pulpit on Sundays. And I'm going to have to stop there for tonight. So, thumbs up for Hymnody.